The papers were already on the table when I walked in. Simone didn't look nervous, she looked relieved. Her mother was smiling before I sat down, and her father hadn't bothered to stand. They had arranged everything: the witnesses, the document, the silence meant to shrink me. What they hadn't considered was a man who would sign his name, cap the pen, and walk out without a single word of protest. While they celebrated, not one of them stopped to wonder why a man they'd just humiliated left, looking more certain than broken. What exactly had they set in motion? If you've ever been counted out by someone who had no idea what you were actually capable of, this one's for you. Hit subscribe and stay with this story, because what happens next is something none of them saw coming. When I walked into the Parker family home that evening, I already knew what was waiting for me. The drive over had been quiet, no radio, no phone calls, just the low hum of my engine and that particular stillness that settles in when you've already accepted something you haven't yet said out loud. Simone had described it as a conversation about our future. The formal tone of her voice told me it was something entirely different. I had built my public life carefully and maintained it for over a decade without a single slip. To everyone who knew me, socially neighbors, colleagues, the woman at the dry cleaner on 5th who recognized my coat, I was Malcolm Reed, independent financial consultant, moderate income, 10-year-old car that ran well enough to make the point. Nothing about me suggested exceptional, and that was not an accident. It was a deliberate architecture I had constructed and preserved, with the kind of discipline most people only apply to things they fear losing. North Star Equity was my creation. I had founded it when I was 32 with a group of people I trusted, structured it through multiple layers of intermediary companies, and ensured that my name appeared nowhere in any public documentation. The fund had grown well beyond what I had originally projected it, now managed a portfolio large enough to make it one of the more significant private equity operations in the country, though very few people in that industry could have told you who actually owned it. That was precisely how I had designed it. I wanted the returns without the visibility, and for 11 years, I had gotten both. When I met Simone, I made a decision that I believed at the time was principled. I would not tell her about North Star. I would let her fall in love with Malcolm Reed, the consultant, and I would watch carefully to see who she revealed herself to be alongside him. I wanted a marriage grounded in something real, built on what she actually thought of me as a man, not what she calculated I was worth on paper. It was not deception in the way I chose to frame it then. It was a standard I set for myself and held to, even as the cost of holding it became harder to justify. In the first 2 years, Simone was easy to love. She was sharp and ambitious, and had an energy that filled rooms. She spoke about building things, about independence, about a life she intended to construct on her own terms. But somewhere around year 3, something in her began to shift. The apartment we shared started to embarrass her. My car became a topic she returned to at dinner. She began measuring the distance between our life and the lives of the people her family moved among, and that distance was never closing fast enough for her satisfaction. She communicated it the way people do when they want you to feel something without being accountable for having said it directly. I noticed it in the way she introduced me at her parents' gatherings, her voice dropping slightly on the word consultant, as if the title needed to be cushioned before it reached the ears of someone important. I noticed it in the way she stopped asking about my work and started asking, with increasing frequency, whether I had considered scaling, expanding, doing something that would put us in a different category. I understood what she was actually asking. She wanted me to become something her family would not have to apologize for. Raymond Parker had built Parker Industrial from a regional manufacturing operation into a company that employed several hundred people across 2 facilities. He was proud of that, and in fairness, the work he had done in the 1980s and 90s had been genuine. But by the time I entered the family, Parker Industrial was running almost entirely on a reputation built by work done 2 decades earlier. Contracts had quietly walked out the door to competitors who had modernized. The supply chain had not been updated in years. Terrence, Simone's older brother, held a title that implied executive responsibility while performing work that did not begin to justify the salary attached to it. Raymond refused to see any of this clearly, because seeing it clearly would have required him to admit that the company he defined himself by had been quietly deteriorating for years. Denise Parker had made up her mind about me within the first month of our introduction. She maintained the performance of courtesy in public, the particular kind that functions as a slow, steady drip of condescension, but her private opinion was never truly private. She made remarks about my car in the way people do when they want you to know they've noticed without being caught noticing. She called me reliable in the tone normally reserved for describing household appliances. I watched her watch me at family dinners for 6 years and understood clearly that in her accounting, I was a liability her daughter had been too stubborn to cut. About 8 months before that night, I learned through professional contacts that Parker Industrial was carrying debt its revenue could no longer adequately service. I went to Raymond directly, not as North Star, not even hinting at North Star, and told him I knew an investor, someone I had worked with quietly over the years, who might be willing to provide a capital arrangement without demanding operational control. It was the most I could offer without exposing myself. Raymond looked at me across his dining room table and told me that Parker Industrial did not need saving, and certainly did not need introductions arranged by a son-in-law with no standing in the financial world. He said it evenly, without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. I did not push. I went home and filed it away as information about who he was, which turned out to be more useful than any investment conversation would have been. That evening, when Simone asked me to come to her parents' home to discuss our future, I understood what I was walking into before I reached the driveway. The house was lit up the way it gets when the family is assembled for something they've decided matters. I sat in my car for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to confirm the thing I already believed. When I stepped through the front door, I was confirmed. The entire Parker family was in the sitting room. Raymond stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man presiding over a proceeding he considered already concluded. Denise was seated with the composed satisfaction of someone who had organized an event and was pleased with the execution. Terrence stood against the far wall, phone in hand, glancing up with the look of a person who had been told this would be worth watching. Simone stood in the center of the room, and the thing that struck me most was how still she was, the stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was finally in it. She removed her ring before she said a single word. She set it on the table, then placed a legal document beside it, divorce papers, already prepared, already notarized, ready for my signature. When she spoke, her voice was flat and deliberate in the way of someone who has removed all feeling from a script by practicing it until the feeling was gone. She said she was not willing to continue building a life with a man who had no trajectory. She said she had been patient for long enough and had finally accepted what the evidence had been telling her for years. Denise made comments about my car and my jacket in that particular way she had directed at no one in the room, meant for everyone in it. Terrence observed, pleasantly enough, that I had never truly belonged in this family, that there had always been a ceiling on what a man like me could reach, and that I had helpfully proven him right by staying comfortably beneath it. Raymond waited until they had both finished before he spoke. He told Simone that she deserved a man who could sustain something real, something that lasted, and that she had been generous to give this as much time as she had. He delivered all of it without looking at me once, as though I were not quite present enough to warrant direct address. I listened to every word. I let it land without deflecting any of it. Then I picked up the pen, signed my name on the document, and walked to the door without looking back. The laughter began before I reached the hallway, and I could still hear it as I stepped outside. I was 2 blocks from the house when my phone rang. It was the senior relationship manager at the bank that held Parker Industrial's primary credit facilities. He informed me that the company had triggered a covenant violation on its final loan instrument earlier that afternoon. The bank had issued an internal notice 72 hours for a qualified buyer to emerge, after which the bank would move to liquidate company assets. He was calling me because my name had appeared in a flagged communication from 8 months prior the conversation I'd had with Raymond, which his own assistant had apparently documented in writing. I sat at a red light and let the information settle around me. Before that night, I had a plan. North Star would approach Parker Industrial through the usual intermediaries, offer terms generous enough to stabilize the company without displacing the family from meaningful ownership, and I would absorb whatever indignity that arrangement required in exchange for keeping the marriage intact. That was before I stood in their living room. That was before I watched 6 years of family dinners and Sunday gatherings reduce themselves to an audience assembled to witness my humiliation. I called my lead attorney. The instruction I gave him was precise. North Star Equity was to submit a formal acquisition offer for 65% of Parker Industrial before midnight. Not through intermediaries this time. This offer would go in under North Star's full legal identity. When the transaction closed, my name would be attached to it in every document that mattered. I was not buying the company to punish them, and I was not buying it to change Simone's mind. She had demonstrated with considerable clarity that her mind was unchanged. I was buying it because 312 people worked in those 2 facilities, and not one of them had any idea that the family collecting their dedication had been driving the company toward collapse for years. If Parker Industrial went to a liquidation buyer, those workers would be out of work within 60 days. That outcome was something I still had the ability to prevent. Whether the Parker family deserved to be rescued was a separate question entirely from whether their employees did. My attorney confirmed the offer would be submitted within the hour. I drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that doesn't feel like an ending. It felt like the first line of something that hadn't been written yet. The morning after I signed those papers, I went into the office early and worked through my usual stack of client files as though the previous evening had been unremarkable. My assistant brought coffee at 8 and commented that I seemed focused. I told her I had a few things on my mind. That was accurate enough. North Star's offer had been submitted before midnight, as instructed. By 9 in the morning, I received confirmation that the bank had acknowledged receipt and routed it to Parker Industrial's board. My attorney informed me that it was, at that point, the only formal acquisition offer on the table. Every other potential buyer the Parker family had approached in the preceding weeks had either declined outright or proposed terms that required liquidating the manufacturing assets, which would have meant closing both facilities, terminating the workforce within the quarter. North Star's offer was structured differently: full debt retirement, operational continuity, no layoffs, and a transition period that gave existing management a defined runway before the new ownership structure took full effect. It was generous by any objective standard. The 65% ownership stake was the price of that generosity. Raymond's response to the offer, relayed through his attorney, was fury. He had spent 30 years building Parker Industrial into something that bore his family's name, and the idea of surrendering majority control to an outside investor was, in his framing, a form of theft, dressed up in legal paperwork. His attorney communicated that Mr. Parker believed the offer undervalued the company's long-term potential. North Star's attorney responded by sending over the bank's internal valuation report, which told a more honest story about what the company was actually worth in its current condition. Raymond stopped contesting the valuation after that, though his fury did not diminish. Terrence made his position clear to Raymond in a separate conversation that I learned about later through the board's records. His proposal was to sell off a portion of the manufacturing equipment to a competitor who had been circling Parker Industrial for 2 years. A transaction that would have generated enough immediate cash to satisfy the bank's demands while allowing the family to retain nominal control. What it would not have done was preserve the jobs of the people on the production floor, who would have been rendered redundant the moment the equipment walked out the door. The board rejected it without much deliberation. Whatever Raymond's faults as a manager, he had enough institutional loyalty to the workforce to recognize that Terrence's plan was indefensible. By the morning of the third day, the Parker family had no remaining options. The bank's deadline was not a negotiating position, it was a calendar fact. North Star's offer was the only path that kept the company intact, the workers employed, and the Parker name above the door. Raymond authorized his board to proceed. During this period, Simone came by the apartment while I was away to collect several items she had decided were hers. My housekeeper mentioned it. I had left clear instructions that she was welcome to take anything she considered personal property, so there was no confrontation. But when she came to collect those things, she also signed the financial separation agreement that my attorney had prepared, the document confirming that each party retained their individual assets, and that no claims would be made against the other's pre-existing holdings. She signed it without asking a single question about its scope. She assumed there was nothing on my side worth asking about. I have thought about that moment more than once since. She had 6 years of information about who I was and how I lived, and she used every piece of it to arrive at the conclusion that the agreement required no scrutiny. The conference room at Parker Industrial's headquarters was designed to project stability: dark wood paneling, a long table that seated 16, framed photographs of the original facility from the 1960s along one wall. Raymond sat at the head of the table. He had dressed formally, and so had Denise, who was seated 2 chairs to his left, despite having no official role in the company's governance. Terrence wore a jacket that still had the price tag crease along the lapel. Simone was there as well, seated near her mother, wearing the composed expression of a woman preparing to make a favorable impression on someone important. The board members were arranged along one side of the table. The bank's representatives sat along the other. Everyone in the room was oriented, in one way or another, toward the door. I walked in with my lead attorney, the bank's transaction counsel, and 3 members of North Star's executive team. I watched the room absorb my entrance in stages. First came the confusion, a half second where several people tried to make sense of why the man who had been in that house 3 nights ago was now walking into this room with a legal team. Denise's expression shifted into something that wanted to be amusement. She leaned slightly towards Simone and said something low enough that I could not hear it, but her face made its meaning clear. Terrence straightened from his position and said my name with the particular tone of someone preparing to have a person removed. The board's chairman rose before Terrence could say anything further. He welcomed me by name, thanked the assembled parties for their patience, and announced that North Star Equity had completed its scheduled payment of Parker Industrial's outstanding debt obligations as of that morning, and that the documentation confirming Northstar's 65% ownership stake was ready for formal execution. He said it in the measured, professional tone of someone reading from a prepared statement, which is exactly what he was doing. The room did not produce sound for several seconds. Raymond was the first to speak. He asked, with a careful steadiness that I could tell was costing him significant effort, what exactly my connection to Northstar Equity was. I told him I was its founder. I had established the fund 11 years prior and had been its controlling principal throughout. I explained clearly, for the record and for the room, that the acquisition offer had been submitted the night following the divorce filing, after the bank's covenant violation notice had been formally issued, and after the separation agreement had been signed. No marital assets had been used in the transaction. No information obtained during the marriage had been leveraged to gain an advantage in the valuation. The timeline was documented at every point. Simone did not speak. She sat very still, and I watched her work through the sequence of events in real time, her expression moving through stages that confirmed she was arriving. One realization at a time, at the full weight of what she had set in motion 3 nights ago. Her mother had gone entirely quiet, which was, in my experience, an unusual condition for Denise Parker. The documents were executed. The bank's representatives confirmed the transaction was complete, and Northstar officially became the majority stakeholder of Parker Industrial before 4 o'clock that afternoon. When appealing to emotion produced no result, the family changed its approach entirely. Raymond retained a separate attorney, who filed for a temporary freeze on the Northstar transaction, claiming that I had obtained proprietary knowledge about Parker Industrial through the marriage and used it to engineer a below-market acquisition. It was a weak argument. The bank's own valuation had set the price, not me, but it was enough to trigger a procedural hold that suspended the bank's final disbursements and caused several suppliers to delay incoming shipments. The manufacturing floor had operating capital for perhaps a week. If the freeze held past that point, production would stop. In the middle of this, my internal audit team completed its preliminary review of Parker Industrial's financials. What they found was not surprising, but was significantly more documented than I had expected. Terrence had established 3 shell companies over a period of 4 years, routing service contracts through them and collecting fees that went nowhere near Parker Industrial's actual operations. Raymond had authorized a series of vendor agreements that existed on paper and had no corresponding delivery records, contracts structured to inflate reported revenue during years when the underlying numbers would have been too damaging to show a lender. And on several of those authorization forms, Simone's signature appeared in the designated approval field, not on the fraudulent contracts themselves, but on the forms that preceded them, documents that, under Parker Industrial's internal governance rules, required a family board member's sign-off before any external vendor agreement could be executed. She may not have known what she was approving, but the signature was there, and its presence made her a named party in a paper trail that any serious investigation would have to account for. Simone came to see me privately after she learned what the audit had uncovered. She sat across from me and told me she had signed those forms without reading them carefully, that Terrence had told her they were routine vendor approvals, that she had trusted her brother because he was her brother. She asked me to suspend the audit, or at minimum ensure the findings were handled in a way that kept her name out of any formal filing. In exchange, she was willing to recommit to the marriage. I listened to all of it, and when she finished, I told her plainly that she had just described a transaction in which she was offering me a marriage in exchange for my silence about a legal matter. I asked her to hear what that sounded like from the outside. She told me I was being cruel. I told her I was being accurate, and that there was a difference. 3 days later, a portion of Northstar's internal audit documentation disappeared from a shared server that Simone still had access to through an administrative oversight that had not yet been corrected. The files appeared in Raymond's attorney's filing the following morning, specifically the sections that could be read to suggest Northstar had been tracking Parker Industrial's financials prior to the divorce. Filing, stripped of the timestamps and contextual data that would have immediately refuted that reading. The temporary freeze was extended. The bank halted all remaining disbursements. 2 suppliers suspended delivery schedules. The manufacturing floor had enough material to run for 5 days. My attorneys assessed the situation and gave me a clear answer. The only path to lifting the freeze was full disclosure. Not selective disclosure, not a curated summary, the complete financial record, including everything the audit had found about Terrence, about Raymond, and about the authorization forms bearing Simone's signature. Anything less would leave the door open for the Parker family's legal team to continue arguing that Northstar had something to hide. I drove home that night, and sat at the table in my kitchen for a long time. I had spent 11 years building something that required no one else's permission to exist. And now I was being asked to make a decision that would determine whether 312 people showed up to a functioning workplace on Monday, or whether the family that employed them simply escaped accountability because I was unwilling to use legally obtained evidence. The answer was not complicated. It was only painful. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning in a downtown courtroom that handled commercial disputes. It was a procedural setting, no jury, no gallery, just a judge, 2 legal teams, and a conference table's worth of documentation. Raymond arrived with 3 attorneys and a posture that suggested he still believed this was a contest he could win. Simone sat beside him in the kind of stillness that comes not from composure but from having run out of moves. My lead attorney opened by establishing the transaction timeline in precise sequence. The bank's covenant violation notice had been issued at 2:47 in the afternoon on the day of the divorce signing. The separation agreement had been executed at 6:12 that evening, witnessed and notarized. Northstar's acquisition offer had been submitted at 11:51 that night. Every document carried a timestamp. Every timestamp was independently verifiable, and the sequence left no room for the interpretation. Raymond's legal team had been advancing that I had used my position as a husband to orchestrate a predatory acquisition of a family company. My attorney laid that out with the kind of methodical patience that tends to make opposing counsel uncomfortable. Raymond's legal team responded by leaning on the authorization forms the argument that I had been gathering internal financial intelligence about Parker Industrial throughout the marriage and had used that knowledge to price the acquisition in a way that benefited Northstar at the company's expense. It was the stronger of their 2 arguments, and it was the one I had expected them to return to. My attorney requested permission to enter the complete audit findings into the record. The judge granted it. What followed was not something I took satisfaction in, though I had made my peace with it the night before. The full audit documentation was entered in sequence. Terrence's shell company structure, the service contracts routed through entities that performed no actual services, the payment records showing funds leaving Parker Industrial and arriving in accounts Terrence controlled. Then Raymond's vendor agreements contracts bearing his signature, referencing suppliers that had no verifiable existence, recorded against revenue figures used to satisfy lender reporting requirements for 3 consecutive years. The picture was not ambiguous. It told its own story without requiring interpretation. Raymond's attorney objected 3 times during the presentation. The judge overruled each objection. When the authorization forms came up, the documents bearing Simone's signature, I watched her face from across the room. She had gone pale in the particular way of someone absorbing confirmation of something they had feared, but hadn't let themselves fully believe until now. My attorney was precise on this point. Her signature appeared on the authorization forms, not on the fraudulent contracts themselves. Whether she had understood the nature of what she was approving was a question the investigation would need to address separately. Northstar was not advancing a specific claim against her. It was disclosing the complete record as required to demonstrate the legitimacy of the transaction. That distinction was real, and I had insisted on making it clearly, because accuracy mattered more to me than achieving a particular outcome for any individual member of the Parker family. Simone spoke once during the proceeding, near the end. Her attorney had advised her to stay quiet, but she addressed the judge anyway, briefly, directly, her voice under control, in the way that takes effort to maintain. She said she had signed the authorization forms in good faith, that her brother had characterized them as routine operational approvals, and that she had never had any knowledge of the fraudulent structures Terrence had built beneath them. She was not asking for sympathy, she said. She was asking for accuracy. I thought that was probably true, and I was glad she had said it herself rather than leaving it to her attorney to argue on her behalf. Then she turned and looked at me directly, the first time in that entire proceeding she had done so, and asked me whether any part of me had considered simply walking away from the company and letting the family deal with the consequences on their own. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, and something about the way she asked it told me she already knew the answer and needed to hear me say it anyway. I told her that the workers in those 2 facilities had not made any of the decisions that put the company in this position, and they were not in any position to protect themselves from the outcomes of those decisions. That was the reason I had moved forward. It had nothing to do with the Parker family one way or the other. She nodded once and looked back at the table. Then she asked me the question I could tell she had been holding back since the conference room at Parker Industrial 3 weeks earlier. She asked whether, if I were still the man she had believed I was, no Northstar, no fund, nothing beyond the consulting work and the apartment and the 10-year-old car, she would be someone I would still have fought for. I told her that was exactly the right question, but she was asking it to the wrong version of herself. The version of her that would have stayed, that would have chosen that man without hesitation, was not the version that had arranged that evening in the sitting room. She already knew that. The question was whether she could live with it. She didn't answer, but the way her expression settled not into pain, but into something quieter than pain, something closer to recognition, told me she had arrived at the same place I had. The marriage had not ended the night she handed me the papers. It had ended sometime earlier, in the accumulation of small decisions that had each seemed manageable in isolation, and had only become visible as a pattern when viewed from a distance. The judge ruled before noon. The temporary freeze was vacated. The transaction timeline was found to be legally sound on all relevant points. North Star Equity's 65% ownership stake in Parker Industrial was confirmed without further condition. The bank released its remaining disbursements, and the holding on supplier accounts was lifted simultaneously. By 1 in the afternoon, the manufacturing floor had confirmed material deliveries were resuming. The consequences for the Parker family resolved in stages over the following weeks. Terrence was arrested 12 days after the hearing, charged with embezzlement and falsification of business records. The amount his shell companies had extracted from Parker Industrial over 4 years came to just under $1.2 million, a figure that, placed alongside the company's deteriorating revenue, explained quite clearly why the debt had become unserviceable. Raymond was removed from the CEO position by the board, which North Star now had the majority votes to direct. Denise and 2 of Raymond's siblings had been receiving monthly consulting fees from Parker Industrial for services. The audit found no documentation to support those arrangements, were terminated without legal action, but they ended, and everyone receiving them was formally notified that their affiliation with the company was concluded. Simone cooperated fully with the investigation. The findings regarding the authorization forms were ultimately insufficient to support a criminal charge. The prosecution determined that evidence of her actual knowledge was not strong enough to proceed. She resigned from her nominal position at Parker Industrial as part of that cooperation, and the divorce was finalized under the terms of the separation agreement she had signed weeks earlier. She received nothing from North Star, and no portion of the shares I had acquired through the transaction. That was the agreement she had signed, with her own name, when she had been certain there was nothing on my side worth protecting. I spent the first month after the transaction closed, working with the new executive team on the things the company actually needed: a restructured supply chain, renegotiated contracts with 3 of its largest clients, and a production schedule recalibrated to what the workforce could genuinely sustain rather than what the previous management had been overpromising on paper. It was detailed, methodical work, and I found it satisfying in the way that honest problems are satisfying when you have the resources to address them properly. I kept the Parker name on the building. The name belonged, in any meaningful sense, to the people who had spent years on that production floor, not to the family that had put it on the sign. Removing it would have been a statement about the Parkers, and I was not interested in making statements. I was interested in running the company correctly. About 3 months after the transaction closed, I held an all-hands meeting at the main facility. It was a practical gathering updates on the new contracts, the restructured supplier agreements, the projected hiring plan for the following year. The people in that room had worked through a period of genuine institutional failure and kept the operation alive by sheer professional commitment. When the business portion of the meeting concluded, I said one thing that was not on the agenda. I told them that the reason this company was still operating had nothing to do with anything I had done in particular. It was because the work they had done for years had created something worth preserving, and I had simply made a decision not to let it be thrown away. That was the complete and accurate version of the story, and they deserved to hear it in those terms. Walking back through the main floor afterward, past the production line running at a pace it hadn't reached in several years, I thought about the night I had sat at a red light 2 blocks from the Parker house and received that phone call. I thought about the version of events in which I had simply let the offer lapse, let the bank proceed, let the liquidation buyer move in, let the family face the natural conclusion of their own management. It would have been the easier decision. No legal proceedings, no audit findings, no difficult questions in a courtroom. Just a clean exit from people who had made their opinion of me abundantly clear. But 312 people would have walked into an empty parking lot on a Monday morning, with no warning and no recourse, for a failure that had nothing to do with them. That was the thing I had not been willing to live with. Not the humiliation in the sitting room, not the laughter as I walked out. Those things had clarified my thinking, but they had not been the reason. The reason was simpler than that, and it had nothing to do with the Parker family at all. What they had believed, when they watched me sign that document and walk out of their house, was that they had correctly identified what I was worth. As it turned out, the only thing they had correctly identified that night was what they were worth themselves. And that particular piece of information, unlike a company acquisition, was something no transaction could reverse. The people in that room had spent years being told they were replaceable by a family that had never once stopped to consider who was actually holding the whole thing together. If this story hit something real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and not one of them ends the way the wrong people expected.